So before I introduce our speaker, Chris Nutt, I just wanted to point out, like, one of our stated goals, Wise Conservatives, is, we want to connect people, we want to educate them, and we want to activate them. But the education piece is the part I just want to talk about for a moment. And just if you humor me for just a second, one of the things that we've noticed is that, there's a lot of things that are thrown around when we're sitting there talking about this, is like, oh, you all are a bunch of conservative prudes and you're just trying to create a controversy. And, there's always been inappropriate things in the library, and I was like, well, that's not really our point. Our point is in the kids section. Our point is at least it shouldn't be, promoted to children. But let me talk just a moment about this perspective that, we're advocating censorship and we're not pro Second Amendment or pro First Amendment. And to talk about that, I think that we need to be able to, as conservatives, make an intelligent argument about why we believe what we believe, because the reality is that we're conservatives. We believe in a godly relationship between man and government. We believe the government should be limited, and it should answer to the people at all times. But more than that, the point that the First Amendment is absolute is, first of all, true to a point. But let's never forget the founders would have never agreed with an interpretation of our rights that is contrary to the Lord. They would never have believed that it is a reasonable exercise of the First Amendment to, for instance, have a satanic ritual in public. That would have never happened in a colonial America, would have never been permitted, and no one would have ever made the ludicrous argument that this was an exercise of the First Amendment. Similarly, what we see, these gay pride parades, again, not to be very graphic, but when you actually find out what goes on during these parades as it's going through town, you will be shocked at what actually goes on. And the idea that nudity and public display of whatever, being, again, vague, but you get the idea that is something that we should support. Drag shows where kids are putting dollar bills in people's waistbands, the idea that these are things that should happen in a public setting and is protected under free speech is a ludicrous argument. So let me tell you a little bit about where we are as conservatives and what we're actually advocating, because our Constitution, when we say we are originalists, we believe in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. We have many gripes as conservatives currently with the way courts have interpreted the Constitution over the last 150 to 175 years. One is Gibbs versus Ogden, right? That was a case that was in the 1930s that basically said that if you were growing a personal garden and you decided not to sell produce to people across state lines, that you were affecting interstate commerce. We believe everyone knows and heard about the Commerce Clause and how that basically has created the expansion of the federal government through the Department of Education, to the FBI. Every single federal agency that you hate exists because they said that if you didn't sell crops to people out of state, that you're affecting interstate commerce. That is a ridiculous interpretation of the Constitution. So by no means do we sit there and say that just because the Supreme Court says something, that therefore it is gospel, and that's in line with what the founders envisioned. This particular concept of free speech is also similarly linked to something called the incorporation doctrine, which followed the 14th Amendment. The Due Process Clause in the 14th Amendment was expansively interpreted by courts to mean that, therefore, all of the aspects of the Bill of Rights can be applied to the states, which was never the intent of the founders. So I'm going to ask you to suspend your shock just for a moment. But conservatives, generally speaking, do not agree with the incorporation doctrine, because what it did is it took a federal government that was far away and had few and enumerated powers, and it basically said that everything that was in the Constitution now applies to the states as a Loctite mechanism to override the state's will, which means that prior to that ridiculous interpretation of the 14th Amendment, that it's truly ridiculous, the Bill of Rights that most pertained to you was the Texas Bill of Rights, so that the states actually decide what is appropriate for the states. So the limits of your free speech would be determined by your local community as it pertains to whether we permit satanic rituals or gay pride parades or anything like that. And I personally am very comfortable with that. I'm much more comfortable with Austin or my community deciding as a group of Christians in a very Christian state what we consider the limits of free speech than Washington, D.C. And for almost all of American history up until about 1880, Actually, about 1920 is when that incorporation doctrine was really fully solidified. Until 1920-something, the view by every constitutional lawyer was that your state Bill of Rights was protected by the Ninth Amendment. Nobody ever talks about the Ninth Amendment anymore. Ninth Amendment is right up there with the 10th Amendment as being the two most important amendments. In fact, Thomas Jefferson said these were the foundation of the Constitution. And the Ninth Amendment basically states that your state Bill of Rights is preeminent over the Bill of Rights of the United States. That is shocking, and I know you've never learned that in school, but that is the absolute God-honest truth of what the founders believed. During the Constitutional Convention, they argued about this entire idea of like, well, if we create a federal Bill of Rights, I mean, eventually that's going to be shoved down the state's throat. And then why do the states even exist if we're telling them what their rights are? Because you would say eventually that the federal Bill of Rights lists a very, very small subset of rights of all the rights you could have. And if it overrides the states, then your state Bill of Rights, which the Texas Bill of Rights is awesome and much longer than the federal Bill of Rights, that means that you don't have those rights. And that's why they put the Ninth Amendment is there, to assert the truth that your state Bill of Rights were actually the preeminent Bill of Rights and is the origin. And the federal Bill of Rights only applied to Washington, D.C. That has completely turned over to the point that now we're sitting there arguing to ourselves as like, well, Washington, D.C. gets to decide what our extent of our freedom of speech is. And that's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous concept, and it's very recent. It's not it's a long-term concept. So when you argue with people, you don't have to go through the incorporation doctrine. You don't have to sit there, but just know in the back of your mind that what we're arguing for as conservatives is an originalist interpretation of the Constitution that existed for most of American history, and that the operation that we're guiding under, or that the guiding factor of our interpretation of the Constitution for the last 100 years has been thwarted by basically a Marxist ideology that has sought to basically remove the states' rights altogether. Definitely since the sexual revolution, we've seen the right of free speech being expanded to crazy levels. But nowhere prior to that would anyone have made the argument that teaching kids what Leah's talking about is protected under free speech. That would actually be considered abuse. And that's the point that Leah was making before, is if I took this book out and started reading it in public, I could actually be charged with abuse if children were around. So no, that's our argument that we're against censorship or, we're pro-freedom of speech. Absolutely we're pro-freedom of speech, but there are things that are not honoring of God, and that's our local community to decide, and that's the historical interpretation of the First Amendment, and as it pertains to the Texas Bill of Rights, which protects our right to free speech as well. So enough said. I hope that made any sense. I kind of threw that together, but I think it's important for us to have that ability as conservatives to articulate our philosophy and how we believe in this idea that the Constitution and the interpretation of the Constitution as understood by the people who wrote it is actually what we're arguing for.